answer as many as I can on the call today. If there's any I can't answer, I will take them away, get some answers for you, and feedback to Sophie to distribute to the group. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Got a brief agenda for you here. I'm going to start by covering at a high level the EA's flood incident response model, how we operate and how we work with our partner organisations. Then we'll start looking at some modelling for flood incidents, data inputs. We'll then do a little on how our forecasting duty officers refine those forecasts from the computer models. A little bit on modelling uncertainty and what can sometimes cause issues with flood forecasting. I'll touch very lightly on our operational activity. And then we did have some pre-session questions from both the Bridgnorth and the Melville flood action groups. So I've got a little bit more specific content for those. And then, as I said, we will finish up with some questions. So to begin, the EA's flood forecasting response. Amongst our sort of 25 other different types of roles, the key ones for our flood incident response that are customer facing are our monitoring forecasting duty officers. So I am one of those. I operate, well, not me personally, but our duty cohort operates 24/7, 365 across the whole country. I work in the Birmingham centre. So that means for 1 week in every 5, I'm on duty 24/7 for a week. And I cover the Schwug area, what we call the Schwug area, which is Shropshire, Herefordshire, Worcestershire and Gloucestershire. So you've got myself as the forecasting duty officer. And then I'm supported by 2 flood warning duty officers. These are the members of staff who issue our flood alerts and our flood warnings. And we have 2 of those on duty at any given time. One covering the Shropshire and Herefordshire counties and one the Gloucestershire and Worcestershire counties. In addition to that, we also have 2 assistant flood warners, and they help our flood warners issue messages. And then beyond that, we have many other staff who organise sort of our tactical response, our operational response in terms of putting up barriers in places like Frankwell and Coleham and Shrewsbury, in Buildwas, in Ironbridge, and in Bewdley. And those are the ones sort of relevant to us today. But your key people are those 5 people who are on. And the one I'm going to focus on today is the forecasting duty officer. Moving on, as I said, those forecasting duty officers cover the 2 patches within West Midlands. That's the Schwug, the Shropshire, Herefordshire, Worcestershire and Gloucestershire area. And then we also cover what we call internally the Schwum area. So Staffordshire, Warwickshire and the West Midlands conurbation. So at a high level, how we flood forecast. So at its core, the EA flood forecasting service, it's a collaboration between the EA and the Met Office. They're our primary partner when it comes to forecasting. So the Met Office, right at the beginning of that process, if we look at this diagram on the left, we've got a process from left to right. So the initial data primarily comes from the Met Office, and that's all of their rainfall data from their rainfall gauges and radars around the country, and then also from their rainfall forecast models. Then at the next step of that process, there's a collaboration called the Flood Forecasting Centre. And that's a high-level collaboration between the EA and the Met Office. And they produce daily sort of broad-scale flood forecasting products. You might be able to see in that second box at the bottom, there's a little map of the country coloured yellow and green. So every day they provide a service to us with the flood outlook for the next 5 days at a very sort of high level, with coloration from green through to red, depending on the high level flood risk. At the EA then, in that central box, we then use that high level overview of data we get from the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre. We then have our own range of computer flood forecasting models, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on those in the next slides. We use those combined with our own data from our rainfall gauges to spit out a raw forecast model data. We then use someone such as myself, one of our flood forecasting duty officers. We then look at these computer models and use a variety of other techniques and data sources that are available to us to refine that forecast. We then write up that forecast, provide it to our partners, but also to yourself as the public. And as a forecaster, I'd be constructing the forecast that goes into our flood alerts and flood warnings. And then my flood forecasting flood warning duty officers would then issue those alerts and warnings to yourself that you'd be familiar with. So that's the fourth box there. And then finally, we also use that, and it's a little less relevant for the flood action groups. We use that to inform our on-the-ground response, both for the agency, so in terms of putting up barriers, closing floodgates, activating pumping stations, but also working really closely with our partners, the police service, the fire service, county councils for things like closing roads and helping evacuate people should the worst occur. So the final thing to touch on here is a little overview of our 3 levels of flood alerting. So you'll hopefully all be familiar with our flood alerts and flood warnings. So the lowest level is a flood alert, and that we use to inform people that flooding is possible. So that's usually flooding of low-lying land, maybe some roads, footpaths, some farmland. Above that, we have flood warnings in the next sort of level up of severity, and that's when flooding is expected. And at that point, we might expect flooding to impact properties, whether that's personal properties or businesses. And then above that, our highest level of risk and our highest level of warning is a severe flood warning. So that's when the flooding might actually pose a risk to life and will cause significant disruption to communities. Those are very rare. I think we've issued maybe 1 or 2 in the past couple of years in the West Midlands. So just to be aware of what those different levels of severity mean. So moving on. We're going to focus a little bit now on our modelling and forecasting, and specifically what we do. So go into a little bit of technical detail here, hopefully find a balance of technicality. So really we have 2 key pieces of data we need to feed into our models. The first of which is our rainfall data. So here at the EA, that comes from 2 primary sources. The first of which is our EA owned and maintained rain gauges. And the map on the left, each one of those numbers represents an area that has a rain gauge, and the colour's not particularly clear, but you'll see one part of the map is green, and that's our Shropshire, Herefordshire, Worcestershire and Gloucestershire area. And then the white bit on the left is Wales and Powys. So obviously, as you know, in Shropshire, a lot of the rain that falls on mid Wales comes down our rivers, down the Severn, the Wye, the Team and various other tributaries into Shropshire, down through Shropshire into Worcestershire and Herefordshire and below. So we've got our EA owned and maintained rain gauges, and all the data from those feeds into our flood forecasting models. And then, as I said previously, we also work really closely with the Met Office. They have a number of their own rain gauges, and they also have radar data from various radar sites around the country. And they also have their own rainfall forecast models. So we use the rainfall data from the rain that's actually fallen on the ground and has been collected by our rain gauges. And then we also use the rainfall forecast models from the Met Office as well, from their supercomputer down in Exeter. The second key piece of information we need to feed into our forecast models is river levels. So we have a number of river level and flow gauges. Primarily, we use river level gauges to inform our flood forecast models. As you can imagine, it's really important when you've got a computer model that's running that it knows what the level is of a particular location or a particular gauge. So we have 130 of those, or more than 130, I believe, in our SWG area. Now, typically we use those to measure river level, but there are a few that do measure flow as well for some specific reasons. Just downstream from us in Shropshire and Worcestershire, we do have Bewdley. That has a flow gauge on it as well, because we maintain a certain flow in the River Severn. So those are our 2 sort of key data sources. We need to get that rainfall data and we need to get that river level data. And we feed that into our models. And if I move on, that then spits out a little graph that looks a lot like this. So for a brief explanation of this graph, right down the middle of it vertically, we've got a red line. That represents the time now. Anything to the left of that is the historic data. And you'll see to the left of that, we've got a little blue trace. So that's the observed data. And I think I pulled this screenshot from the gauge at Welsh Bridge in the middle of Shrewsbury. So the blue line, that's the observed data that we've actually seen that river level get to. Anything to the right of that vertical line in red, that's our forecast model output. So that is what our computer model is saying is the most likely scenario for what we'll see over the next few days. Now we have a number of different model lines. There's only one on that graph, but we do have access internally to a number of different ones. We have what we call our 5-day forecast. So that's our longest outlook forecast, and that's the furthest we can go into the future in terms of looking at the forecast. we've got two models that run on that. We've got our best estimate model. So that gives us an indication of what is the most likely scenario we're going to see in terms of level at that gauge. And I should have said, going up the vertical axes, we've got the height at that river gauge. Our reasonable worst case model, that shows, as the name suggests, what we could reasonably expect to be the worst case scenario. So what you'll see is the best estimate usually is a lower forecast, and that's the most likely scenario, but we do also model for what we can reasonably foresee as being the most likely worst case scenario. So we work and plan to the reasonable worst case, so no one hopefully gets caught out, but we do hopefully expect to see the conditions being more like the best estimate. Then finally, we have a third model available to us, and that's just a short range 2-day operational model. So that only looks 2 days into the future. And that model is most useful when we've actually seen a particular rainfall or storm event start to hit us. And as soon as we get water on the ground and water in our catchments and our rivers, that's the model we use for that very short term forecasting. Now, if we move on, did not move on, there we go. So as you can expect, we've got all this data feeding into our models from ourselves and the Met Office. And you'll know, if you follow the weather, which I'm sure many of you do, that often the rainfall forecast that the Met Office might provide can be highly uncertain. You'll appreciate that within the next 24 hours, 48 hours, it's usually very accurate. But as you start going out beyond 3 days, out towards 5 days, there's a lot of things that can cause uncertainty in that rainfall model. And as that rainfall model kind of informs our flood forecast model, any uncertainty that sits within that rainfall model before it even gets put into the flood forecast model creates a level of uncertainty. So what we use, we get that raw model output spat out on a screen. We then have flood forecasters such as myself who refine that forecast, and we do that in a number of different ways. So a really powerful tool we've got available to us is correlations. And you'll see on this graph on the screen what we can do if we've got a particular river gauge. So let's take Welsh Bridge in Shrewsbury. If we've got various river gauges upstream of that, so we've got things like Montford, Crew Green, upstream on the Severn, we know that when the River Severn peaks at Crew Green at X many meters, it's very likely to peak downstream at Welsh Bridge at Y meters. And we can actually build a relationship between the levels we see upstream and the levels we see downstream. So that way, when we see a peak of a flood event pass a gauge upstream, so say Crew Green upstream of Shrewsbury, we can then use that to improve the certainty of our forecast for all the downstream sites in, say, Welsh Bridge, and then moving down the river down towards Buildwas, and then at Iron Bridge, and then Bridge North and further downstream. So that's a really powerful tool we've got available to us, because that relationship between flood peak heights at various gauges on the river is usually very strong. As well as that, we've got a number of other things. So first of all, the range of a forecast really narrows as time reduces. So the closer in the future we're looking, the far more certainty we can have in a rainfall event creating a certain river peak. So when we're looking at sort of 5 days out, we really do have a lot of uncertainty in that forecast. But as we get closer to the time, that certainty really improves. We can also compare to historic events. If we know a flood, say we had some big ones in 2020 on the River Severn, if we know that reached 5 meters in Shrewsbury, and we've seen a similar amount of rainfall in this new flood event, we're likely to get similar levels in Shrewsbury this time. We can also look at the inflow from various different tributaries. That's particularly important for big rivers like the Severn, the Wye and the Team. All those tributaries are putting in flows from other catchments in different areas, and they'll all impact the levels in those main rivers. We then use local knowledge of things like the geography, land use, things like that to then further refine the forecast. And finally, a really useful tool that's really quite a new thing that we've got, and we're currently doing a trial on it this summer, is ensemble forecasting. So that's where we'll run our flood model, not the once, but maybe 25, 30 times, slightly different starting conditions. We can then produce a range of forecasts from that and then take an average. So we've got a really exciting trial going on at the moment that in the next sort of year or two, if we can bring that live and we get good results from that, should improve the accuracy of our forecasts even further. So that's what myself as a forecaster does. I take that raw model output, I use my local knowledge from past events, from inflow and tributaries, some other rivers upstream, the ground conditions, the land use type, to refine that forecast and inform the flood alerts and flood warnings that we put out to yourselves. Having said that, refining the forecast, it's also really important to acknowledge that there is a lot of uncertainty in forecast. As I touched on at the beginning, that rainfall amount that comes in, not only is the rainfall data we get from the Met Office potentially uncertain, where rain actually falls can make a big difference in terms of location amount. So if you get a big rainfall event that falls maybe 20 miles further west in Powys, and it ends up going down towards the Aberystwyth and that sort of direction towards the sea, we might not see any of that rain, any of that water come down to us in Shropshire. If it falls 20 miles further east, all lands in up towards Welshpool and Newtown and that way, that's all going to come down our way into Shropshire. So just those slight changes in location can really make a difference. Ground conditions, that can really make a difference as well. Things like soil moisture deficit, so that's how much capacity our ground has to absorb water. In the summer, the ground has typically got a higher soil moisture deficit. That means any rain that falls on it is sucked up by the ground rather than flowing off into our rivers. Whereas in the winter, you imagine a waterlogged field, it's got no capacity to absorb any further water. So any rain that falls on it will run straight off into the rivers. Similarly, in the winter, if it freezes, the ground then has no capability to absorb water. It'll all flow off quickly. And even in the summer, when you get a particularly hot, dry summer like we've just seen, the ground's baked hard, no capacity to absorb any water. Again, it will run straight off into our rivers more quickly. Things like snowmelt events, particularly over the higher ground in Powys and the Welsh borders, you've got a lot of snow and then you get a sudden rapid warming that can melt that snow very quickly and cause sort of a real surge of water coming down our rivers. Additionally, you've got things like the local geography, the land use, whether it's urban, where you've got a lot of concrete, tarmac buildings, water runs into the rivers a lot more quickly. You've got more rural areas, farmland, woodland, that absorbs the rainfall and slows its flow into the river. Again, similarly to that, local runoff and surface water impacts are a similar issue. Things like thunderstorms, they're really difficult to track exactly where they're going to fall. A lot of our rainfall models have a sort of resolution of 2.5 by 2.5 kilometre cells. So they can only say rain might fall somewhere within that 2.5 kilometre square. A thunderstorm, sort of big thunderstorm cloud, might only be a kilometre square. So we can't, and the Met Office can't forecast exact. They can know a general area where a thunderstorm might fall, but they can't tell specifically where it might land. And if you get an unlucky event where an intense thunderstorm falls right over a town centre, I think we saw an event in Much Wenlock last year or maybe the year before, where a thunderstorm hit right over the town, and then that caused some surface water flooding there, and that can be really difficult to forecast the exact track and intensity of those. Flow levels in the models, so we have our flood forecasting models. They're designed to be the most reliable and accurate that they can be at high flows, because that's when we're potentially seeing the most impactful and damaging floods. That does mean at lower level floods, they're maybe not quite as accurate. Second to last, non-forecast sites. We do have a number of sites where we have river gauges, but they don't have a forecasting model. I think 90% plus of our sites do have a forecast model associated with a river gauge, but there are a few sites, I think primarily down in the sort of Cheltenham, Gloucester area, less so in Shropshire, that don't have a forecast, but that is another thing that can cause uncertainty. And then the final thing I'll touch on is just the volume of forecast sites we have. As a forecaster, I'm monitoring 130 different river gauges and flood models at any given time on duty as a single person. If we get a big flood event that covers the whole of the area, that's a lot of gauges to monitor and provide forecasts for, and then issue alerts and warnings for as well. So moving on, a couple of other considerations. I will touch on this. We do have a number of what we call rapid response catchments. So these are sort of catchments that respond very quickly to high level rainfall. You get a lot of rainfall on a particularly narrow valley, perhaps. You can see flooding happen very quickly. And what we do have is we have specialised alerts and warnings that we can put out really quickly. So if we do do notice we're getting a heavy rainfall event over those catchments, we can issue those flood warnings more quickly. I think the ones relevant to us today, we've got Lanny Blodwell just up on the border, and then we've got Muchwellock as well, and then Coalbrookdale just in Telford and Wrekin, the 3 in Shropshire or adjacent to Shropshire that are designated as rapid response catchments. Finally, before I move on to the more specific location stuff for Bridgnorth and Melverley, we have our operational activity. It's a good thing to touch on because we do have a number of operational sites in Shropshire. So these are operations and things that our duty officers out on the ground go and do. We have a number of flood barriers. I think most relevant to us today are the ones in Shrewsbury. So you've got, if you visited Shrewsbury in a flood event, when the river's high, you'll have seen around Frankwell by the Theatre 7, there are some barriers that go up there. And if the level gets high enough, Smithfield Road along the river gets closed. We've also got barriers around at Colham Head, around near the Abbey, the other side of the town, the other side of the river loop, where we have barriers go up and pumps. And then further down the Severn, we've got barriers at Ironbridge, Bewdley, and Hereford on the River Wye. We've also got a number of floodgates, pumping stations, debris screens on smaller watercourses, and then specific flood storage areas and flood alleviation schemes as well. So these are all things that our operatives go out and operate, maintain during those flood events on the advice of our flood forecasters when we predict the river is going to reach certain levels. So that's what I wanted to cover sort of on our approach to model and forecasting, how we gather that data, the sort of data we gather, what that does in the computer model, and then how we then interpret that, refine it. And I also wanted to kind of give you a bit of an idea of what can cause uncertainty, because despite our best efforts, there are times when forecasts go out that maybe aren't accurate. We under or over forecast, we get the timings wrong. Happily acknowledge that. But it is important to acknowledge that there are difficulties in forecasting, in any forecasting, whether it's flood forecasting, weather forecasting, and the sort of uncertainties that go into that and can cause those issues. So we did have some questions before the session from both the Bridgnorth and the Melverley flood groups. So I'll just cover a little bit of those. So we'll go to Bridgnorth first, work alphabetically. So I'd imagine you're all familiar with Bridgnorth. It sits on the River Severn. We've got a river gauge right in the centre of town there. We've got many other gauges upstream on the Severn, but the other ones particularly relevant to Bridgnorth are the Burcote, I'm not sure how you say it, on the River Wharfe, just upstream of Bridgnorth. So it's important we monitor the levels coming down that, because obviously everything that flows down the wharf then goes into the Severn. So if we have a lot of rain over the wharf catchment, we need to be incorporating that into our forecast for Bridgnorth, because that will affect that. But the Moorbrook gauge just downstream of Bridgnorth, so less relevant to Bridgnorth itself, but obviously all the flow that goes through Bridgnorth then goes on down to Bewdley and beyond. So for those of you from Bridgnorth, if there is anyone on the call tonight, we do the two alerts, the alerts and warnings that cover Bridgnorth. We've got the River Severn in Shropshire flood alert, so that's our lowest level of warning. And that's actually issued off a number of different gauges. Those are our thresholds. So if the River Severn is forecast to reach that level, any of those levels, any of those gauges upstream, we will issue that flood alert. So see that River Severn in Shropshire can actually be issued off the gauge all the way up in Crew Green, upstream of Shrewsbury. So if you ever see the River Severn in Shropshire flood alert issued and you think the river level in Bridgnorth, it really isn't that high at all, that's likely because it's been issued off those peaks higher upstream in Crew Green and Montford. Then the higher level of severity, we've got the River Severn at Bridgnorth. So that's a more specifically localised flood warning for Bridgnorth itself. And we'll issue that if we are expecting the river level at Bridgnorth to reach 4.2 metres or higher. And then for Bridgnorth itself, as I mentioned, correlations earlier, we can correlate the levels upstream at Buildwas, Welshbridge and Montford. So if we see a peak at Welshbridge, I think off the top of my head, the time it takes for a peak to travel from Shrewsbury down to Bridgnorth is about 36 hours, depending on the size of the event. So as soon as that peak has peaked upstream at Welsh Bridge in Shrewsbury, we can then get a very accurate idea of what the peak will likely be in Bridge North in the next day or two. We can also correlate the combined effects of the River Severn at Welsh Bridge and the River Tern as well, one of the major tributaries upstream of Bridge North. And then finally, my final point for Bridge North is, and this was the question from the group, we have a new river gauge going in there very shortly. And the old river gauge was really quite prone to silting up, so we're moving to a new radar gauge. So funding has now been secured for that, or it was secured some time ago, and that is through the property level flood resilience scheme that's been delivered around Bridge North town. And that has paid for a new radar gauge to be installed on the main bridge through town on the upstream face. Should be far more reliable. Radar gauges are the most modern way of measuring river levels. They bounce a little radar signal down from the gauge to the water surface, and then it times how long it takes it to bounce back up to the gauge. So they're not prone to things like silting up or being blocked with debris like the older tube types are. Most of the equipment's now arrived in our depot in Shrewsbury. Got a few parts outstanding with suppliers as of today, but it's scheduled to be fitted in late October, which is good timing for a potential winter flood season. What they'll do is they'll install that gauge, run it in tandem with the old one for a week or so to just compare the data from both. And then once they're happy that the data has been validated and it's accurate, they'll then make the data from the new gauge available on the .gov website. So that's available. I'll share a few links. If you go on the .gov website and search for a particular place, you can see the river level gauge. You can get a live feed of what the river level is doing at any particular time. You can view on a map and you can go look at the river gauges upstream and downstream. I suppose the upstream ones are the ones of interest, so you can see what the river's doing upstream of where you are. So yeah, that will be coming live very shortly in the next month or so. So moving on, last little bit of my presentation, we'll move on to Melverley. Again, Melverley is a particularly complicated area. It sits right on the confluence. You'll see running broadly from left to right on that map there. You've got the River Severn, and then coming in from the top left corner, that's the River Vyrnwy. So Melverley sits right in that confluence near the Crew Green gauge. Really quite a flat area, large areas of floodplain all around there. And then you've got two of our largest rivers in the Shropshire area interacting there. So you see a number of gauges there on the Severn. We've got Landrinio gauge upstream of the confluence, the Crew Green gauge just below the confluence of the two, right on the bridge there. A little further down, we've got the K Howell gauge, and then down in the bottom right of the map, we've also got Hayes Basin, a large flood storage area there. We've also got the flood channel at Maesbrook inputting from up near the top right of the map, just upstream of K Howell. And then our first gauge upstream on the Vyrnwy is just off the map, and that's Lannamonock. So we've got a number of gauges there, all feeding in. Really important to have that number of gauges. As I said, it's a complex area, and modelling, particularly for that confluence, is very difficult. So it's really important that we have a lot of data that we can feed into that model. Having that large number of gauges in a small sort of geographic area really helps us with that. Last couple of slides now. That's a simplified river model of that. So we've got the two levels of warning that are relevant to Melverley as well. We've got the Severn Vyrnwy confluence flood alert at the lower level, and that can either be issued off the Lannamonock, the Maesbrook, which I realise I misspelt, or the K Howell gauges if we reach any of those thresholds. And then at a high level, we've got the more specific flood warning, which is the higher level one for the River Vyrnwy at Melverley. And we'll issue that if we're forecasting to reach any of those thresholds at either Lannamonock, K Howell, or Crew Green. And again, we've got some really good correlations for the Melverley area upstream. So on the Severn, at Landrinio and Buttington up towards Welshpool, we've got some strong correlations there. We've also got Lannamonock upstream on the Vyrnwy. And then we can also combine the flows from both the Vyrnwy and the Severn by looking at both Buttington, Landrinio, and then combining that with Lannamonock to give us a really good idea of what's going on around that confluence area. So the final thing I want to touch on for the specific questions we received from the Melverley group is the new Severn Vyrnwy confluence model that's coming. So that's been built now by one of our partners. Now, the model delivery date was supposed to be in place by late this year. It's now been pushed back to mid-2026. That, as I said, is because that confluence area is particularly hydrodynamically complex. You've got two major rivers interacting, both really active big rivers, and then you've got a very complex floodplain area there as well. So we've had to use some more complex methodology to better represent that interaction between the two rivers and that floodplain. That does mean, however, that taking that extra time to do that, we will have a really high quality model, and we'll have far greater confidence in the outputs of that than the current model and the approach that we're using previously. Unfortunately, as it's still been built, I don't have any nice visuals to share with you all, but I'm sure the flood resilience team at the EA can pass on some information to your flood action groups when that model is in place. And that should hopefully bring some improved confidence in our forecasts and improved confidence in the alerts and warnings that we provide to you. So that brings me, if I can get to the right side, to the end of my presentation. Appreciate you're taking the time to listen to that. I realize that's quite a lot of information to digest and take in. But I hope you found that all useful. So I will pass you back to Sophie. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I'm very happy to take any questions the groups have.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jack. So we're now opening up to questions. So we've got one question already in the chat. If anyone else has any other questions, either pop your question in the chat, or if you raise your hand, then you can unmute yourself to, you should be able to unmute yourself to ask if you raise your hand. We've got a question from Mark Davis. Are there any initiatives planned to increase/improve the data sets to forecast with more accuracy?
Thanks, Sophie. Evening, Mark. Thank you for your question. Yes, I mean, we have a constant program of model improvement. So that's not necessarily improving the data sets, that's improving the actual sort of computational model behind the forecast. So each catchment and each river we have has a model associated with it. So each of those 130 gauges I mentioned in our Schwug area has a model associated with it, and we have a constant program of improvement. As I said, we're working on the Severn Vyrnwy confluence at the moment, but I'm aware of plans to look at the Y model and the T model very shortly as well in the next sort of year. And as we improve the models for those particularly large rivers, that then improves the model, everything downstream really, for all the tributaries as well. But in terms of the data sets that we've got, the Met Office as well, they're constantly improving their rainfall and weather models. So any improvements they make sort of cascade down into our flood models as well. And we also have a continuous program of introducing new river and rain gauges. I know in Alton, just outside of Ludlow, we've recently put in a new gauge there, and we've had a new model built as well. And that's a new flood area, and that's a new warning area we're now able to provide to that village there. Hopefully that's answered your question, and feel free to, if you do have any more you'd like to add on that, please add it or raise your hand in them. Oh, good question. Long-term forecast for this season. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but if you go to the Met Office, they provide a really good, they have a 6 to 30 day outlook, but then they also do a seasonal outlook as well. If I have a bit of time at the end of the meeting, I will dig out the outlook for the winter ahead, which I think is what you're looking for, and I'll see if I can send that to Sophie to send on, because the Met Office produce every winter or before every winter a really nice little graphic that says this winter is 50% more likely to be a wet winter or a mild winter or a dry winter. So I'll hunt that out and pass that on.
Thank
you, Mark.
So we've got a question in the Q&A bit from Di from the Ludlow group. I think there's a few questions there, so we'll work through them one by one. So are there any plans to measure the flow of the team?
Thank you, Di. Good evening. So yeah, I'll take the questions one by one. So any plans to measure the flow of the team? Not at the moment. So what we do typically is measure level. And what what there actually is that means we don't typically install flow gauges everywhere, because they're more expensive and more complex, is that we can interpolate what the flow is through a series of really well-established equations. If we know, typically we install our river level gauges on or near weirs, and you can measure really quite accurately the height of flow over a weir and correlate that to a flow level. So that often means that we don't need to install flow gauges specifically. So next question. As far as I'm aware, there aren't currently any plans to install any, for the EA, to install any barriers or floodgates on the team in Ludlow. So the Environment Agency deals only with main rivers. So relevant to you there, that is the team and its inflows just above the Corve and the Onny, and a few smaller ones upstream like the Red Lake. Smaller watercourses are dealt with by Shropshire Council, what they call ordinary watercourses. But as far as I'm aware, there aren't currently any schemes to install any large scale flood defences in Ludlow. Next question, radar gauge. No plans for that in Ludlow at the moment, and that is because the current tube type gauge we have is accurate in Ludlow. We don't have the issues that we have with it silting up like we do on the 7 in Bridgnorth. So there's no need for one, is essentially what we've got there. But if we did ever see in the future any issues like that, as we've done with Bridgnorth, we would look to upgrade it. And then finally, a flood channel. Do you mean sort of a built sort of thing to kind of improve the flow around that confluence area of the Corve and the team right in the centre of town?
Yes, sort of. One of the residents has come up with a suggestion to dig a channel. At the, I don't know, I doubt you will know Ludlow very well, do you?
Funnily enough, I grew up in the Corvedale, so I know Ludlow very well.
Oh, okay, right. So the bottom of Lower Corve Street is where they get the most flood damage, and they get it from two sides. They get it from the street and they get it from the River Corve. And somebody that lives just a little way up there, doesn't get flooded but has an idea, is to dig a channel in that field at the bottom of Lower Corve Street. That would now I'm not sure it would help, but as we've got you on there, and as actually I can now speak and you can now see me, I thought I might as well raise it.
Yeah, I mean, what we have is when we're looking at building new flood alleviation schemes, as we call them, we do use our models. And a really important thing that we do when we're building a new flood scheme is we cannot construct anything that's going to make flooding worse for people downstream or upstream. And we use our models to assess how we can compensate for any additional flows we might cause. So yeah, it's really good to hear these ideas, and I can pass these back. I think I know the area well. That little piece of field between the two rivers and the Apple Green Garage.
It does a fantastic job of being a floodplain.
Yes, and I mean, really, that's a key thing as well. Those floodplains are vital to absorbing that water when we get those high level events, and then slowing it downstream. But yeah, I'll pass that back to the team.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch my camera off now because I can hear better.
Thank you, Di. I'm happy to move on to the next question from Clive and Denise. Just take a second to have a read of it. Okay, yeah. So the question is, we need to do our own forecasting for what's going on upstream of Ludlow on the three rivers. So I'm going to assume you mean the team, the Onny and the Corve there. Can the time taken for a peak to move between gauges be made available to us? Unfortunately not, and that is because it really depends on the flood event. It depends on the amount of flow in a particular river as to how quickly that peak moves downstream. So it can really vary quite significantly. On the really big rivers like this, well, really only the Severn in the West Midlands, that time is a little more consistent from sort of peak to peak, from gauge to gauge. But the smaller the rivers, the more quickly they can respond, and the more changeable that time is from peak to peak at the gauges. So yeah, unfortunately, the best you can do is look at those gauges upstream on the Corve. I know it's just upstream of the confluence on the Corve. Oni, I think you've got one at Onnebury, and then the team obviously upstream. You've got Lentwood-Ine and then Knighton. I think the best you can do is to keep looking at those and get an idea.
Okay, thanks, Jack. That's what we do.
Thank you, Clive. Back to you, Sophie.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Jack?
Just seen one pop up.
What could be the reason for a gauge level reading to jump up drastically? The flood alert at Maesbrook was received once water was already over the road, higher than 1.26 meters. Does the EA monitor possibly faulty readings, and does the asset team check the gauges?
Yes. So in short, the answer to your question, we do monitor them as a forecasting duty officer. Part of my sort of daily checks and my responsibilities are to monitor all our gauges and look for faults. Sometimes we see data spikes for a number of reasons. Sometimes we get gauges that are vandalized, they get damaged by debris being washed down the river, a tree trunk hits a gauge, that's the end of it. They can get smaller bits of debris stuck in them, which can give erroneous readings. So I'm monitoring for anything like that. And then, yeah, we have a dedicated hydrology and telemetry team, and they're on duty 24/7 as well. If we have any issues with gauges, I give them a call. They go out and fix gauges round the clock. So this specific one, this to me, if the people on the call can see the little screenshot that Katya's popped in, there's a real jump there, and that to me looks like there was an issue with the gauge before it jumped, because it's flatlined at 0 meters, and then suddenly it's leapt up over the flood alert level. So people should be, the forecasting duty officers should be picking that up when there is a gauge issue like that. And if we do have a gauge issue that can't be fixed immediately, we can use those correlations from sites upstream to hopefully, particularly on the bigger rivers where they're available, to inform those forecasts downstream. Obviously with a little less accuracy if the gauges aren't working, but we do sort of do our best to provide those forecasts.
Is there a way for on the website directly to report any issues that people may see, and then triggering a little alarm where those gauges are indicating something that's perhaps faulty, or because the contact there's a contact box of contact floodline for advice, which is the phone, text phone, and
yes.
Yeah, would that be the phone line that you would like those kind of errors to be reported?
It would be, yes. I will just pop in the chat what you mentioned. So it's something I touched on earlier as well. Our Check for Flooding website. I've just popped in the one for the River Severn level at Crew Green. And if you look on that link, up near the top underneath the main heading, you can see a map. So you can scroll around and have a look at other different gauging sites we've got. You can click to go to the upstream or downstream gauge. It will show you its current level. And then within that, you'll see what sort of levels you might expect to see flooding. And then down at the bottom, as you said, Katia, we've got the floodline number. So if you're monitoring a gauge and you think this doesn't look right, there's a big spike in the data or something, if you call our floodline and report that will get passed on to our internal duty officers. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one question that I've got would be the interaction you have with NRW. So, particularly for the communities that are on the border, if there were to be an issue, if you were to notice an issue with an NRW gauge, is that something that you've got a system for, for interacting between the two of you?
Yes, very much so. Yes, of those on the call, NRW, that's Natural Resources Wales. They're our sort of Welsh equivalent. As I said earlier on, a lot of our rain and a lot of our water comes down from Wales into Shropshire. So yeah, we work very closely with NRW. They work in the same way. They issue flood alerts and flood warnings for the Welsh side of the border. We issue on the English side. All the data, we share model data though. So obviously all the water that comes down from Wales in the rivers feeds into ours. So we share all that data. And yeah, if there are any gauge faults or anything, we can report that back to their duty officers, and they can go out and fix them, and likewise in return. So yeah, we've got a really strong working relationship with NRW.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions that anybody's got? No?
Thank you.
Right, well, thank you all for joining. I hope you found it to be a useful session. If you after this meeting, if you have any sudden brainwave and you've got any questions, if you email either myself or Abby, and we can forward your questions on to Jack and the flood resilience team and get an answer back to you. So thank you, everybody, and I'll let everybody get back to their evenings.
And thank you. It's been
Thank you
really
all.
useful. Thank you very much, Jack. And what a pleasure it was that you know Ludlow.
I know. You got lucky.
Anyway, thank you very much. It's been really, really useful. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.